City finance classes.
Okay, welcome to the City Council Workshop session today for April 10th, 2023. I'd like to call the workshop to order at 4:04 p.m. Roll call, please.
Councilmember White,
Here.
Councilmember Voigt,
Here.
Councilmember Lara,
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Fenn,
Here.
Mayor Martinez.
Here. And we stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, please. Ready, begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, and with that, do we have public comment for this workshop?
I have no written comments. Grace, do we have any callers on the line?
I have no callers on the line.
Okay, seeing none, then we'll go to our action item today, the City of Beaumont Sewer Rate Study Workshop. We have a report by Ms. Eustachian.
Yes, good evening, Mayor and Council. In December of 2022, the City Council approved a contract with Raftellus Financial Consultants, Inc. They have preparing a sewer rate study for us, evaluating the revenue needs of the wastewater fund. The final goals of the project would include a 5-year plan for fair and reasonable wastewater rates, 10-year financial plan, making sure that the fund has enough revenues to cover capital improvement projects, and updating financing and rate schedule models. So Raftellus has been working really hard on this, and for this evening for you, we have a preliminary view of the results of this study. So I'm going to pass it over to John Wright, who is with Raftellus.
Hello.
Thank you for having me. Well, as Jennifer indicated, my name is John Wright. I'm with the firm Raftellus, and I've been working quite a bit with your staff over the past 2 to 3 months, especially Jennifer and Thaxton, and really appreciate your fantastic help that they've provided. What I want to cover this afternoon for you is to just talk a little bit our project scope, which Jennifer kind of alluded to. I want to give just a little bit of background on California Proposition 218 and what it means in terms of setting utility rates, in this case for sewer service. We're going to show you 3 different financial plans. I'll then talk briefly about the cost of service analysis and then present some preliminary proposed rates for 2024. So Jennifer alluded to much of this in her introductory comments, but there is a pretty broad scope here. We will cover tonight the 10-year financial plan, or at least the key first 5 years of it. We'll talk about the cost of service analysis, your existing rate structure and proposed rate structures. And then some of the other things that'll be coming out of this study, as Jennifer indicated, one of them is a 5-year projection of rates, which presumably will be the period that you'll want to issue your Proposition 218 notice for. A survey of sewer rates at adjacent agencies, and then we'll be handing off to Jennifer a big Microsoft Excel model and a detailed rate study report. I promise I won't read this entire slide, but just some of the key highlights of Prop 218. Utility rates charged by municipalities or governmental agencies can't exceed the costs you incur to provide service. Any revenue you get must be used for utility service. What you charge in terms of your rates has to be in proportion to the costs you incur to provide the service. And then it goes without saying the service must be available. And so in the context of one of these rate studies, Prop 218 is always on our mind, asking the question, how do we best try to comply with those requirements? So here is a little graphic of the rate study process. And, you know, the first step in the process, which will be on the lower left, says rate setting framework. This is really where a consultant like myself will sit down with our utility client and understand key financial issues, understand important financial policies that may be at the forefront in terms of, for example, the level of cash reserves they need to maintain, and then also discuss pricing objectives, which is another way of saying discuss the existing rate structure, whether they're happy with it or not, and how it might change. Having established that, we'd move into the financial planning process, and I'm going to be talking more about financial planning, but ultimately the financial planning process is an attempt to identify the appropriate financing sources to meet projected costs. Then, having established the amount of rate revenues we need in the financial planning process, we go through a cost of service analysis, and this is where we attempt to allocate the costs that we incur to provide service to each customer class to them based on their proportional demands, and that defines how much rate revenue we need to collect from them. And once we do that, we're able to design rates for each customer class. And then finally, the last step in the process is the rate adoption process, and this is your Prop 218 notice. And even before that is the preparation of a very comprehensive report. And one of the things that we really want to do in that report for you is have an extremely detailed report that really explains why we did what we did, how we did what we did, why we believe it's appropriate. And the reason that's a good thing for you is that if you're ever challenged and somebody wants to litigate over rates, which doesn't happen too often, you'll have something to fall back on. And all of this is taking place within the context of attempting to comply with Prop 218. So a little bit of detail on the financial planning objectives, and I think these objectives would be the same for any study. We want to determine the optimal mix of financing for your sewer enterprise fund. And typically that mix is rate revenues from what customers pay, capacity fees, what developers pay when they connect to your system, and potentially the use of external debt financing. And so that optimal mix may be a combination of rate revenues and debt. We're going to look at a financial planning scenario that features rate revenues and debt. Or depending on council's preference, it may only be rate revenues and no debt financing. And we'll be looking at a scenario with all rate revenues and no debt as well. Now, what do we want to achieve from the financial planning process? Well, we want to cover our projected costs, both operating expenses and capital costs. We want to maintain adequate cash reserves as defined by the city's financial policies. We want to maintain an adequate level of debt service coverage, a level of revenue compared to our annual debt service. And we have to do that in two ways. One, we have to meet your internal policy targets. Secondarily, at a minimum, we have to meet your contractually obligated debt service coverage. And then lastly, the hope is that when we get that optimal mix of financing, we can minimize customer bill impacts. So without reading all of these little bullet points, within the context of the financial plan, there are certain key inputs. And those key inputs, first off, are estimating customer account growth, estimating the level of flow or billed sewer discharges that each customer class will be sending to your wastewater treatment plant over the planning horizon. And when we have that estimate of customer accounts and billed discharges, we can then develop a forecast of revenue at existing rates if your rates remain unchanged. What we do once we have that forecast of revenues at existing rates is we forecast all of your costs, your O&M, your CIP, your debt service, and obviously the cash reserve balances we need to maintain. And that differential between revenue at existing rates and projected costs basically defines a funding gap. And that funding gap is the amount we need to obtain through some source, primarily rate revenues and or external debt financing. Well, once we go through that process, some key outputs come out of the financial planning activity. One is a forecast of the annual revenue requirement from rates, the amount of rate revenue we need to earn from customers on a total system basis. And also, a natural outcome of that is the annual percentage increase in rate revenues we need to have. Is it 3% a year, 5% a year, or even more? And, that's a key point for decision makers such as council as you consider different financial planning options. Okay, so we really looked at two scenarios, but before we get to the two scenarios that are realistic, we also wanted to show you what I have called the do-nothing scenario. And the do-nothing scenario is where we don't have any rate increases and we don't have any external debt financing. It's basically status quo. Second scenario we looked at was a financial plan that only features rate increases to meet our funding gap. And then the third scenario was a combination of rate increases and debt financing. So here's the do-nothing plan. This is only showing you a projection for the first 5 years of the financial planning horizon through FY 2028. And I think the thing to focus on the left-hand graphic with the blue bars is that if we don't have any sort of rate increases, we don't issue any sort of external debt financing, beginning in 2025, we're in a situation where our cash reserves actually fall below zero. Not only are we not meeting our minimum cash reserve targets, but our actual amount of cash reserves goes negative. Interestingly, over on the right-hand side is a calculation of debt service coverage. And even with no rate increases, we are still meeting our debt service coverage requirement. Now, why is that? Well, you're meeting your debt service coverage requirements right now under your existing rates. And the calculation of debt service coverage does not involve CIP expenditures. It's only revenues and O&M. So the key thing to focus on are the ending reserve balances. So given the level of projected spending we have for the sewer enterprise fund, doing nothing is probably not an option. Okay, the second financial scenario we looked at was basically paying for all of our fund expenditures, I should say, with only rate increases. And down at the bottom of this slide, what you'll note is there's a series of rate increases shown. 9%, this is rate revenue increases, 9% in 2024, 9% in 2025, 7% in 26, 5% in 27, and then we actually don't have a rate increase in FY 28. So the outcome of having these rate increases that you see down below is that in FY 24, and I'm looking at the blue bars on the left, in FY 24, our projected balance of cash is roughly equal to our actual target. And then in 25 and 26 and 27, even with the level of rate increases shown below, we are cash positive. Our ending balances are above zero, but they are below our target. And then finally, we start to catch up from a cash perspective in FY 28. Now, you may wonder, why would we show you this scenario where in FY 25, 26, and 27, we still fall below our cash targets? Well, the reason is that if you wanted to meet those cash targets with rates only, you'd have exceptionally large increases, very large double-digit increases. So we felt it was more realistic to at least present you the notion of 2 9% increases followed by 2 7s. We won't meet our targets, but we don't believe we'll go cash negative. And by the way, because we're getting more rate revenue, our debt service coverage is very healthy on the far right graph. The third financial planning scenario we looked at was a combination of rate increases and external debt financing. And if we focus on the table at the bottom of this slide, you see that we have plugged into the financial planning model a $7 million external debt financing. Presumably, that could take the form of either a state revolving fund loan or even the city issuing revenue bonds. And that $7 million of debt financing allows a couple things to happen. Number one, it mitigates the level of rate revenue increases we need. So for example, we estimate that in FY24 through FY27, you could have a series of 6% increases rather than 2 9s followed by 2 7s. It also achieves the outcome of allowing the Sewer Enterprise Fund to have cash balances that meet your target reserves. And I feel embarrassed to admit this, but I'm blanking on exactly what those target reserves are. But we spent a lot of time on that with Jennifer especially. But it's a good outcome from a cash balance perspective. And despite the fact that we're issuing that debt, we can meet our minimum target debt service coverage. My memory is that your contractually required minimum is 1.2 times, and our financial planning target is 1.5. So, 3 options, really 2 of them, potentially realistic. Option 1 is do nothing. Go negative very, very rapidly. Option 2 is don't use debt and have pretty large revenue increases. Option 3 is some mix of debt versus and rate revenue increases, but not nearly as high as a rate increase only option. And Jennifer, I don't know if now is the time to stop and maybe talk about these financial planning scenarios if council, I think there may be a couple more supporting slides. Let me go through those first. Okay, so what's driving all of this stuff? Well, through 2028, our planned inflation-adjusted capital improvement program expenditures are $30 million. So there's a lot of CIP. And what we've attempted to do is list some of the key CIP projects that are driving that $29.7 million. We see projects associated with your force main construction. That alone is like $4.1 million. We see wet well construction, $4.4 million. Lift station condition assessment improvements, $2.7. And then there's a lot of miscellaneous other projects that are not quite of that magnitude, but they add up to $15.1 million. And so, like all utilities, what's driving this for you is not O&M. That's usually always the case. It is what you want to reinvest into your system in order to maintain service level quality. Now, within the context of all of these financial plans is in 2023, the current fiscal year, one of the things that Jennifer has established is a repair and replacement capital fund. And this is a long-term fund to help you pay for ongoing expenditures associated with primarily the repair and replacement of underground infrastructure, such as your collection and conveyance system. And the financial planning scenarios continue to reflect funding for that repair and replacement set aside. $2 million is what has been plugged into the 3 financial planning scenarios. But I want you to recognize that money is just not sitting there building up. There is actually repair and replacement CIP in your CIP plan that's going to be running through this fund starting as early as this year and throughout the planning horizon. So it's not just accumulating. And indeed, there's enough CIP in your CIP program that what we forecast is by 2028, Even though we're placing $2 million a year into this repair and replacement fund, we only have about $280,000 left at the end of 2028. So what's all the action causing the need for the rate increases? It's really primarily CIP. Now, oftentimes in making a presentation like this, there are questions that the council might have regarding what sort of inflation assumptions were utilized in the financial planning model. And so here they are, basically just sort of general inflation, which is items that are not specifically identified, as needing a special level of inflation. Our current assumption is in 2024 and 2025, 5%. And that's based on what's going on currently with the inflation rate in the overall economy. We have a 4% inflation factor built in for FY28, and we don't mitigate down to a more maybe generic 3% until we have 4% in 2026, then we don't move down to a more generic 3% until 2027. Personnel costs are seen as growing at 2.5% a year. Administrative costs, 5%, followed by 3s. Operating costs of 5%, assumption in 24, followed by 3s. Utilities, and this would primarily be Southern California Edison, 5% in each of the first 5 years of the planning horizon. And then construction cost inflation at 5, 5, 4, 3, 3. And so oftentimes when you would look at a table like this prior to our experience with inflation over the past couple of years, what you might see is percentages more in the 2 to 4% range. Here the assumptions for inflation are a little bit higher than that. That's the financial planning piece. Would you like me to just continue?
Let's see if there's any questions first.
Okay.
Is there any questions with council before we move this on?
Okay, so, yeah. Let's see if we have council questions. I know I have a few for us. So we'll start off with Mayor Pro Tem.
Yes, thank you, John. You might be answering this later, but a question that I have is the example of bringing in the $7 million debt for the financing option. What is the impact of that beyond 2028? Is that on is that a 30-year repayment on that, or what would be, I guess, the terms of what we'd be expecting on that loan?
Yes, sir. I believe, and I feel embarrassed, I'm not absolutely 100% certain on this, that the assumption is 30 years at approximately 4 to 5%, which is in effect a fully amortizing loan with the same principal and interest payment that you would have just if you were taking out a home mortgage. And it may be that as you go to issue debt, if you do, and you're working with the state of California, or you're working with your financial advisor, let's say an investment bank, they can structure those debt payments a little bit differently. But the 30 years at 4 to 5% on a fully amortizing loan is a really good conservative start to projecting cash outflows for debt service.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Couple from me. The capacity fees, how do we charge the capacity fees? Are we charging, because that's part of one of the revenue sources. Is that, just remind me on capacity fees.
So those are on new development, and they're a part of the permitting process.
Is it a one-time fee?
It is a one-time fee.
Okay, that's my question. And the operating costs include personnel? So equipment and
Correct.
personnel?
Correct.
Okay. And then for the FY 2028, it's meeting the target without an increase that year. Is that because the 2027 is catching up with 28? Is that why the target there on the slide that shows that we meet the target at 2028, even though we don't have a
Yes, sir.
revenue?
So kind of what happens is every year that we impose that rate revenue increase, there's kind of almost a compounding effect
Okay.
associated with it. And that higher level of rate revenue rolls forward.
Okay, and nothing on the CIP is for expansion to facility, right? It's only for repair at this moment? Not any of that,
There are expansion, there are growth-related CIP projects, only a couple, and Thaxton may be able to answer that question better than I.
So out of that 29 million, I guess, is the question, is that all repair and replace, or does that include some of the expansion of some sort? That was my question.
I think it does include some expansion.
Yeah, namely the Mesa improvements are growth-related and expansion.
And that 15 on the other, that's quite a bit other. Is that just a whole bunch of projects in there, or is that we're foreseeing something's coming up and therefore it all goes in that, or will that be something brought down a little bit more, a little more precise breakdown?
There are specific projects that compose that 15 million. But you have a pretty extensive list of projects that you'd like to achieve. And quite frankly, what we tried to focus on before we got to that catch-all other category is just really big ones or really prominent ones. But sir, of course, we can provide you a list with all of those CIP expenditures.
And the only reason I ask is I'm a hard sell on the debt thing. So in order to talk about debt, I'm gonna really need to see, you know, what is it that we're talking about? And is it that wish list, or is that something? Because we've got several things, you know, we'll talk about, you know, police station and stuff. Those are things we're also looking at going into debt for, possibly. We haven't got that far yet in our discussion. But I don't want to start talking about debt here and then all of a sudden we've got, you know, all this debt before we even get to some of these other projects. So that's just a food for thought coming up. And then the last question on recycled water revenue. Is that only a cost recovery type of a revenue, or is that something that could be used to meet targets as well?
Well, we don't foresee, or it's not reflected in this rate study at this time because we don't know
Right,
the direction. But you're asking just in general,
In general,
how it would
would-
be applied. So, John, if we were to have some kind of an agreement and have a rate associated with our recycled water production, how would it be applied?
This may not be a pleasant answer, but it's an honest one. I think what we would do is we would try to understand the recycled water costs you're incurring. So maybe you're incurring, for example, what might be known as tertiary treatment costs, additional treatment functions necessary to treat the water up to state of California standards. You probably will also have a recycled water transmission and distribution system called a purple pipe system because it only carries recycled water and the pipes are actually colored purple. And so we would want to understand what those recycle specific costs are compared to demands and calculate a rate.
Good enough for now. All right, I'm good. Any others for now? Councilmember Laura?
Yeah, we've been maintaining a capital improvement plan for the wastewater treatment plant, but has that been coming out of general fund, or has that been coming out of the wastewater?
That's at wastewater.
Okay, so, because I know that we approved the Mesa lift station, but that's only a portion of what we need to complete that project, correct?
Right.
Okay. You talk about the increase with no debt versus the increase with debt, right?
Yes, sir.
You add 7 million to the increase with debt, and then you spread the 30% out over 5 years, and still covers the $7 million debt?
Well, it covers the debt service
The debt service. okay.
associated with that debt issue. Yes, sir.
So why wouldn't you spread since it's 30% on either, why wouldn't you spread the 30% out over 5 years with no debt so that the impacts on the increases are level across the 5-year span? Is there a reason that we don't do that, or it's not offered?
And sir, I'm gonna go to the slide that I think you're inquiring about, which is slide number 13.
Yes,
And you see those 9% increases there.
yes, sir.
Sir, I think the reason that you see 9% increases in those first 2 years is we need to build up revenue momentum so that our cash reserve balance does not go negative in 2025. As opposed to perhaps having a series of 7 or 8% increases that are smooth.
Right.
We do dip perilously close to going cash reserve negative in 2025. I think that's why it's structured with 2 nines.
Okay, but even if we do nothing, we're still showing that we're negative in 2025. So I thought any increase is going to keep us above that line. What is the rate then, or the percentage that would be the break even? Do we know that?
Sir, I apologize. I don't have an answer for you right now. I'm sorry.
Just a question to think about. Okay. So when we look at, on slide 15,
Yes, sir.
oh, I'm sorry. Slide 16,
Okay.
we have, what is included, or the 5% of administrative, what does that include outside of personnel and ongoing operating expenses?
Jennifer, you need to answer that.
So personnel is above administrative. So in the administrative portion, I believe that includes you have your overhead that is charged for, that pays to the general fund.
Okay.
And there's some other line items in there, but for the most part, it's the overhead charge.
Okay, so the overhead is not included in operating then, or our regular operating?
No, that is separate.
Okay, all right, just want to make sure. Thank you very much. That's all I have.
Councilmember White?
Yeah, some of the questions I have, you probably are going to defer to your second part of your presentation. But, so I'd like to get a little bit, some of the historical for some of those of us who were not here when we funded the $110 million upgrade to the plant. That was $110 million that we created all debt, correct? And then we increased the sewer rates at, I'm just remembering off the top of my head, 5% a year
5%.
for 5 years. And so when was the last increase?
This fiscal year,
2020?
3. That's the current fiscal year right now.
Okay. And that, I know this is it's just a question for, to make a point. That $110 million is not paid off, right?
No,
Okay,
No.
that's on a debt service for,
it was for the 30 years.
For 30 years.
Yeah, and that
Okay.
bonds were issued in 2018.
okay, so we're now looking at issuing another 7 million in bonds with your second proposal?
Yes, sir.
And on a 30-year rate?
I believe it is, sir.
And that's that's 7 million versus 110 million. And for 110 million, we increased it at 5% a year for 5 years. For 7 million, we're not even close to 5% for 5 years. What's the difference? Where am I missing the numbers?
I'm unsure how you financed that 110 million and what level of cash you started with.
They were revenue bonds, and the cash reserves were, well, I'd have to go back and look. I'm not totally sure on that, but I believe we were at our 25% reserve minimum.
Okay, and in 2029, we'll be coming back for another Prop 218 rate study and increase, likely, correct?
I can't predict that it'll be an increase, but I would say it's likely that it
Okay.
would be.
And again, this is probably in the second section, but when we talk about a percent increase in rates, any idea what that is in dollar rates for the individual homeowners?
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Okay. Are any of the projects in the CIP, are they all ones we cannot do without?
Some of them that are listed on here specifically were identified in the wastewater master plan as current existing deficiencies, and we've kind of kicked them down the road the last 2 years. The recommendation from that study was to address those immediately. The other part of the significant part of the other is to just start the concept of a repair and replace. So I'm totally cognizant of, the money that was spent on the plant and everything. That's to buy the brand new plant and get it going and treat to the new levels. But much like a street improvement plan or something like that, nothing like that has been in place or existed. And, as the downtown area is about 100 years old as far as infrastructure goes. And it's just kind of us trying to get a start and get one in place and take it into the future, establish one.
I'm going to put that down as a no.
It's always council's discretion, but
Sure.
Those are the recommended.
So I know we need to keep our general fund and our wastewater fund separate. Can we go for debt from our city fund? Instead of issuing debt, can we borrow from the city, pay back the city fund? Borrow 7 million, pay back the city fund? And is there a way to do that in a way that would lower the rate increases that we're talking about?
I don't know what your current or projected borrowing rate is on general obligation debt, but I would say that since it's backed by the full faith and credit and your taxing ability, as well as the overall general fund revenue stream, it probably would be a slightly lower rate.
Would we still, in your estimate, would we still be paying the city back the $7 million over a 30-year period?
Sir, I think my guess here is, and I feel horrible saying guess, but my gut tells me it may be slightly less debt service, but I think it's still a pretty significant amount of debt service, whether you get GO bonds or sewer-specific debt.
Okay, and we have significant reserves in our general fund over what the minimum recommended amount of reserves is. We have some unspent money from last fiscal year. But again, we can't just take the 7 million that we need from our other reserves and apply that to the wastewater fund without having a borrowing agreement between the two funds?
Yeah, I'm not I do not stand in front of you as an attorney, but my sense is that you would need to have some formal agreement. And I think that it'd probably be wise to have legal counsel weigh in on that question and ask if there are any Proposition 218 ramifications associated with using funds from the general fund, which were obtained using whatever mechanism, for utility-specific items. Maybe that's not a problem, but it's probably worth having counsel give a little bit of guidance on that.
Okay, thank you. That was all my questions for this point. Thank you.
Councilmember Laura? Oh, you're good? All right, let's go ahead and continue and get to some of the numbers, because it sounds like we're heading that direction.
Yeah, we sure are. Okay, quick overview of the cost of service analysis. So in cost of service, we want to try to determine the amount of rate revenue required from each customer class. And really, the amount of revenue we need from each customer class is based on the proportional demands they place on our sewer system. And those demands come in really three categories. The two most important by far are the volume of wastewater discharges that each customer class causes to flow into our wastewater treatment plant and move along our collection and conveyance system and then be processed by the plant. And another really important characteristic is the strength loadings of those wastewater discharges. And those strength loadings impose treatment plant costs to deal with, and it's really an important part of one of these cost of service studies to develop estimates of strength loadings for each class, which are based on the best available information. A third category that might cause costs to be drawn to an individual customer class are, for example, how many customer accounts there are associated with each class, or how many equivalent dwelling units might be associated with, for example, your residential customers, or how many students might be associated with schools. But the bottom line, and this is the Prop 218 catch, is that we want to make sure that we allocate cost to customer classes based on proportional demands they impose on your system. Put another way, we want to make sure that we adequately estimate the costs you're incurring to serve each class. And then the objective is, I think I've already talked about that. So this is a little bit of a complex slide, but when we think about the cost of service analysis, the first question we ask ourselves is, we identified in the financial plan an overall level of rate revenue that had to be recovered from your ratepayers, your customers. And the first question we ask ourselves is, well, what sort of functional activities on your system are those costs that have to be recovered from customers being incurred to meet? Well, on a sewer system, those would include things like treatment, collection and conveyance, lift stations, biosolids handling. And so we would identify all of the reasons we're incurring costs which are driving the need for rate revenue. The next step in the process is we would ask ourselves, well, okay, we understand the functions that we're paying for with this rate revenue. What types of demands are those functions meeting? And those functions are meeting in this rate study 3 types of demand: volume or flow, and then strength loadings, biochemical oxygen demand, total suspended solids, and total dissolved solids. And so what we do is we try to arrive at estimates for each class for these strength loadings. And we know that our functions on our system are meeting these different types of demands. Probably the easiest is we know that our collection and conveyance system is meeting flow. And that our treatment plan is meeting some combination of flow and strength. Well, after we identify what types of demand we're meeting with our functionalized costs, we then have to ask ourselves, what are the total units of service that our wastewater system is dealing with? And a way to think of that is, what's the total amount of flow expressed in 100 cubic feet? What's the total amount of biochemical oxygen demand expressed in pounds, or suspended solids, or total dissolved solids expressed in pounds? And when we know what our total system units of service are, that is composed of all of the contributions of our various customer classes. So the inputs: functionalized costs, allocation of costs to demand, units of service, customer class units of service. On the right-hand side, we have our outputs, and what you would see is an estimate on the top of the yellow box of how much does it cost us on our system to treat 100 cubic feet of wastewater discharges? How much does it cost us to treat a pound of BOD suspended solids or total dissolved solids? And then for each customer class, we know what their units of volume, BOD, TSS, and TDS are, and we can come up with that customer class revenue requirement. That amount all adds up to match the amount of rate revenue we said we needed as part of the financial planning process. And there's a lot more to it, but we'd be here probably 6 hours going through it, so I've tried to kind of cut to the chase on it for you. And Thaxton and Jennifer have been living it for 2 months. Here's a summary of the customer class cost of service estimated for 2024. And this is financial planning scenario 2, where there's no debt. We're talking about a 9% rate revenue increase in 2024. And really the most you can probably say about this slide is that in lines 1 through basically 18, it identifies each one of your customer classes, and then it identifies costs that have been considered variable in nature: flow, strength, and costs that are basically fixed in nature. And down in the lower right-hand side of this slide, you'll see a number of 14.72 million. Well, 14.72 million is the amount of rate revenue we predicted we needed via the financial planning process. So, okay. And by the way, I'm about to show you preliminary proposed rates. But I want to note on this slide that you see the words preliminary in red. And the reason you see the words preliminary in red is that, as I've probably indicated umpteen times, these studies require a lot of analytics regarding customer flow, what customers are contributing to your wastewater treatment plant, and also analytics regarding the strength of customer discharges. Faxton and I have spent quite a bit of time looking at this. I think that it's labeled preliminary because I think we'd like to do one more deep dive together before we recommend final rates to you. That's why you're seeing preliminary. So the work's been done, but I think we want to do even a little bit more analytics behind it. Okay, preliminary proposed rates. So, well, what do we want to do in rate design? We want to recover the cost of service for each customer class as estimated in our cost of service process. And those costs, as noted previously, are going to be volumetric or variable, fixed, which would recover through monthly fixed charges. And then as part of those monthly fixed charges, there are minor costs like customer service and billing and collection. Once again, this is all done with a Prop 218 umbrella. So when you think about Prop 218, we want the financial plan to be recovering legitimate sewer costs. In the cost of service study, we want to develop the cost of service for each class based on the proportional demands each class imposes on your system. And in rate design, we want to develop rates that collect that amount of rate revenue, not more, not less, so that we don't have any inappropriate subsidies. Now, in your existing rate design, you're in a situation where, and I'm going to show you that on the next slide, but very quickly, residential customers in your existing rate design only pay monthly fixed charges. And that has been continued in the rates that you're going to be seeing here momentarily. Your commercial customers pay a combination of volumetric rates and monthly fixed charges. And then your industrial customers pay volumetric rates and monthly fixed charges. They're, at least they were initially designed that way. Here is your existing rate structure. The rates that you've got in place right now, as you can see, single-family residential, as noted previously, is paying a monthly charge. Multifamily is paying less than single-family because the volume of discharges for a monthly family dwelling unit are less than single-family. Schools are currently paying on a per-student basis. And I'm in the top half of this slide, by the way, called fixed charges. One of the things that's really, really interesting about your rate structure, and frankly something I've never seen previously in any of my work, is that you charge fixed charges that are based on strength loading. So if you look in commercial, low, medium, and high, the monthly fixed charges associated with commercial, low, medium, and high are delineated by strength loading. It's not necessarily wrong. I've just never seen it. It's very unique. And then for each one of your currently 6 industrial customers, there's a unique combination of fixed and or volumetric that are being charged based on some really detailed analysis of their flow and strength loading characteristics. Okay, in the bottom half of this slide, you see volumetric rates. And those volumetric rates are not paid by single-family residential. They're not paid by schools, but they are paid by your commercial customers. And there they are. The higher the strength loadings, your volumetric rates go up. And then once again, for industrial, it's unique for each customer class. Okay, so this slide shows preliminary fixed charges that are the outcome of this rate study. And now that I sit here and look at it in front of you, I wish I had put line numbers on the,
Mayor, may I ask a quick question?
Yes, sir.
Before we move on? Can you remind me again what strength loading means?
yes, sir. So when you think about customers discharging flow into your wastewater treatment system, those customers and their discharges have a certain level of strength associated with them. And one strength loading characteristic is a biochemical oxygen demand. Thaxton, jump in and define BOD for me, because you're the engineer.
It's universally used measure of strength, and it's derived from a test that takes place over 5 days. You get initial oxygen level, and then you see how much is depleted. And the higher it is, the stronger the source of wastewater. So essentially, what that strength characteristic does, and I think what John's going to get to, is the BOD strength out of a domestic household is different than that out of, say, a restaurant or a manufacturer or something along those lines.
A second, so I think it's the level of oxygen that's necessary
That's consumed during the breakdown.
that's
of the-
concerned during the, I guess, the treatment process. Is that the way to think of it? Another type of strength loading is suspended solids. And these are not huge chunks of anything. These are basically very microscopic solids that have made it through the filtration process going into the wastewater treatment plant, and that have to be nonetheless kind of filtered out and allowed to kind of drop to the bottom. And I don't know what process that is, Thaxton, but there are unique suspended solid contributions for different types of customers.
Yeah, certainly. That would be attributed to the membrane filtration process. So we're allowed basically no suspended solids, or if you were to hold water up, that it would look clear as our discharge. And as you can imagine, even if you took the physical solids out of your first step in a wastewater treatment, obviously the water's not clear. So that's that measure. And then the next one, which is we all probably know more than we ever wanted to know about, is TDS, and that's the dissolved solids. That's where the state came in and made us start taking out all the dissolved solids. So that's anything. So the TSS would be caught on a filter. If you think of a coffee filter, the dissolved solids would still make it through, but if you put that on a hot plate and cooked it, you'd have the white crust on your, that's the dissolved solids. And that's something, really specific to our region, where we're tasked with anti-degradation clause and taking it out to levels that are lower than it's actually fed.
Okay, thank you. And just one comment. It's not the first time we've heard that our financing is unusual in all areas of our city. But
I say that with the greatest amount of respect. So, but if you're willing, let's just take a look at this slide a little bit more. And I wish I had put lines across it and then also numbered each line. But let's focus on residential. Over on the far right, there's a percentage difference. And for single-family residential, the preliminary results of this study are that the monthly charge paid by single-family residential would go up 5.6%. Now, this is an overall 9% increase in 2024. The estimate is that multifamily or / mobile home would actually, the rate would go down by 1.4%. I very seldom see utilities that lower the rates for any class, but schools, the estimated increase in the per student amount paid by schools is 3%. Then when we get down into the commercial section of these fixed charges, you see that there are big changes. And I'm going to ask you to focus on the column that says current bill. And the current bill paid by a low volume strength loading commercial customer is $25.77. Likewise, a medium strength loading commercial customer, $47.21. And then finally, a high strength loading customer, $151.07. Now, the rate design that we are proposing for you tonight to consider, the preliminary rate design, is that the monthly fixed charge for commercial, regardless of strength, would fall down to $6.70. Now, why is that? Well, the reason is that the type of costs that are recovered from the monthly fixed charge are not really strength-related costs. They're costs associated with customer service or billing and collection or general and administrative costs. To my knowledge, those costs do not vary by strength. And I will tell you that this rate design for fixed charges is more normative that you might see, for example, in adjacent utilities. And so because of the move down to $6.70 per monthly service charge, you can see over in the dollar difference and the percentage difference, there are big declines. Okay, moving down to industrial. When your rate study was done 5 years ago, your previous rate study, very, very large fixed charges were developed for your industrial customers. And I think Thaxton, one of them was even $4,700 a month or something like that. Very, very large fixed charges. What has been done in this proposed preliminary rate structure is to note that the costs that are associated with administering your industrial customers are not really variable by what their strength loadings are. So right now, what Thaxton and his team have to do is they have to inspect industrial customers. Thaxton, talk about some other areas that you need to perform administrative for industrial.
So all of these industrial, it's important to remember that this is the fixed charge. This is just the charge regardless of the volumetric output. Some of these are classified by their SIC code as industrial, and therefore it requires us to permit them to implement a pre-treatment program. We have to go inspect them. We have to put out samplers quarterly, collect samples, send it to a lab, pay for analysis, do reports, and then also that kind of rolls into the next part. We take those numbers and adjust the volumetric part. But even if one of these places were to not put a drop down the sewer, there's still an administrative charge associated with them because of the requirements for us to have them on a pre-treatment and permitted.
Yeah, and I think that, Thaxton, we estimated the cost of doing that at approximately $50,000 in FY24. And this cost is spread over the 6 industrial customer accounts. That works out to $645 a month.
Correct.
Now, that's fixed. Now let's look at volumetric. So let's start at the top. The reason you see NA associated with single and multifamily residential and NA associated with schools is they don't really pay volumetric rates. Schools are charged based on a per student basis, and single family residential is charged monthly based on other equivalent dwelling units. So we get down to commercial customers in the middle, and you can see that the volumetric rates for commercial customers have increased very substantially. And so, as an example, we currently charge low-strength commercial customers $2.77 per HCF. The preliminary amount that's coming out of this current rate study is $5.81.
What is ACF?
100 cubic feet. And there is also an increase in the volumetric rates for medium and high-strength customers. And then likewise, there are volumetric rate increases for our industrial customers. So let's ask ourselves what's happening here. Why are commercial and industrial volumetric rates going up so much? Well, I think you're seeing the effect of two things. This rate study has indicated that, and I'm going to a previous slide, that based on our current analytics associated with flow and strength, that single-family residential customers should only be paying 5.6% more. The overall system increase is 9%. Single-family residential customers are therefore estimated to have a cost of service that only goes up by 5, while the total system is going up by 9. And right now, when you look at the Sewer Enterprise Fund, approximately 2/3 of the total revenue across the Sewer Enterprise Fund is single-family residential. So if you're not getting a full 9% from single-family residential, that amount that you're not getting that's less than 9% has to be recovered from commercial and industrial. That's number one. The second thing that's happening is we're dramatically decreasing the monthly service charge. And to the extent the monthly service charge goes down, volumetric rates go up. So now let's look at bill impacts. Oh, sorry, one other thing before bill impacts. One of the things we've done is we put together an analysis of the profile of revenue recovery for the Sewer Enterprise Fund. And in FY23, 84% of the rate revenue coming into the Sewer Enterprise Fund is fixed. The reason 84% is fixed is single-family residential doesn't pay volumetric rates. So you got a really high level of fixed revenue recovery. In the preliminary proposed rates for FY24, that number falls in the same range, but it drops to 80.4%. But no dramatic shift in the profile of revenue recovery. Okay, so these numbers are a little bit tiny, but bill impacts, this is FY24 only for residential, which is the top box. It doesn't really change from what you saw previously. A residential monthly bill would go up by 5.6%, despite the total system increase of 9%. Multifamily is a little bit less by 1.4% than what they're currently paying. Schools are estimated to go up by 3%. Then in the bottom box below that, it's a little bit tough to see, but there are estimated FY24 bill impacts for commercial low-strength customers, commercial medium-strength customers. Well, it's always something, isn't it? And then commercial high-strength in the far right, even though it says medium. And you can see that the bottom line, the last line in that second box, is a percentage estimated increase in the bill for commercial low, medium, and high-strength customers. 75%, 47%, 58%. Now, we understand these are very large bill impacts for commercials, which is why we've labeled these rates preliminary and why we intend to do checking and rechecking and some additional analytics associated with this flow and strength assumptions used for all these customer classes. But this is how it's shaking out, that your commercial customers would pay more on a total bill basis. Okay, the last slide here is bill impacts for industrial customers. And you have a total of 6 industrial customers. And the bill impacts for Duraplastics, which is the top half of the slide on the left, 78% total increase. Pericone Juice, a 306% total increase. They're currently paying $166,000. The estimate is their revenue requirement is going to be approximately $674,000.
And this is where I should probably step in and remind everyone that we have the separate rate agreement with Pericone so that over the last few years, they could put the potential difference between estimated bill and this fixed cost or agreed upon rate into their on-site pretreatment system. So using that rate analysis at the time, if we weren't under the special rate agreement for the 166, their total estimated cost per that analysis would have been $543,000.
It's a little bit complex, but
Which is a 24% increase.
precision stamping, a very, very large increase, obviously, 1,075%. Down on the bottom, CJ Foods, 45.4%. There's a CJ Food, there's 2 accounts. The first account, 45%. The second account, 84%. And then Rudolph Food Company, 335%. And I'm not sure what additional to say about that, but these bill impacts for industrial and commercial are the current fallout of our study. This study is being done using industry standard cost of service principles. And we're being very, very careful in all of the costs we assign to different customer classes. And this is currently how it's come out. Jennifer, I don't know if there's anything more for me to add. I think that was kind of the end of my formal presentation.
I would just add that when looking at the study, we're going as what does the wastewater fund need? Moving forward, getting our deferred maintenance up to date, how are we going to keep the fund sustainable? So we do need to remember this is an enterprise fund and they should be self-sustaining. The general fund is subsidizing a portion of those overhead admin costs already. We did a cost allocation plan earlier in the fiscal year. That cost allocation plan came back as an overhead charge to wastewater fund should be around $1.5 million. And we are currently charging $650,000. So there is some subsidization already going on with the general fund. So the overall look is to say, okay, where should we be? Where does the fund need to be? Just to make sure it is self-sustaining. When it comes to the repair and replace that we have created, that has been something that we started to try to start working on to getting to those deferred maintenance projects, all those underground ongoing pipe replacements, and how are we going to do that? And so what's come up in the study is that we contribute a little bit more so that we're able to continuously work on that. And that way we're trying to avoid kind of kicking the can down the road longer, and with that sometimes comes a higher price tag. So there are things that, that the council can choose to do as far as, you could lower down that overhead cost allocation more if you wanted to, or you could push out CIP projects. And I would defer to Thaxton on what the outcome of that would be. But the overall of this workshop here is to kind of say, your thoughts and your feedback on the study and what it is that you would like for us to bring back.
Yeah. And so Jennifer's kind of highlighted the financial planning side. What I want to highlight for you is, on one hand, we're retaining the same rate structure for residential customers, the vast bulk of revenues on your system. On the other hand, we are suggesting a different monthly fixed charge scheme than what you currently have, one that is not related to strength. And based on the assumptions currently used in the model of things like flow, how much of that flow goes back to a treatment plant, what the strength loadings should be for each customer class, we're seeing the fallout percentage increases that we've talked about, including the very large ones for your commercial and industrial customers. That's kind of my summary right now. Thaxton, anything to add from your end on that?
No, I think did a good job of summing it up.
Okay, so let's jump in with some council questions first. You have a question there?
Yes.
All right, so start with Mayor Pro Tem Fan.
So I want to go back to the potential funding models. Capacity fee was mentioned. My question is most of the CIP projects, is that in reference to repair and replace? Or is there a need because there's more construction and more development coming? Because my general thoughts is, hey, the new guys should pay their fair share too and not put that burden on the existing ratepayers.
Yeah, that's been taken into account in the models. There's a operating covered CIP, there is some growth CIP, and there's also the repair and replace. And the capacity fees are for growth related. So you want those CIP projects to go with that, which the model has calculated those capacity revenues coming in to go towards those growth related CIP projects.
And have we been proactive enough to catch those projects early on and not be late to the game and say, oh, well, new development came in and was approved. We didn't have a capacity fee in place, so therefore now we can't collect that on that development. We got to wait for the next one to come through. And folks are sneaking under the radar. Do we have that kind of a problem?
I'd defer that to Thaxton.
I'd probably have to ask Mr. Hart to comment on that specific item.
We've had capacity fees in place for a while.
Okay, all right.
Good evening. So yeah, as projects come in, part of the development of the master plan that we did is we created a hydraulic model to assess, the capacity of our system now, and then a tool to be able to utilize what the impacts of future development would be. So as new projects come in for development, they would be required to, they would provide a deposit and we would run a hydraulic model of their proposed development in our system to identify any either deficiencies or upgrades that are needed. And they would be responsible for the installation of those.
Okay, all right, thank you. I'm good for right now.
Okay. Councilmember White?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for all your hard work on this study, and thank you to the staff for your hard work as well. I do have a couple questions kind of along the lines with Councilmember Fenn. We talked about industrial, and you stated that you took 50,000 and divided it by 6, which I then divided it by the 12. So are we allocate for 12 per month?
Yeah, 50,000 divided by 6 accounts divided by 12.
Correct. What do we do in the next 5 years if somebody's added? I think that was some of what you were saying. I understand the capacity, but how do they then get added in? Let's say they come online in 2 years. What would their fixed fee then look like?
Yeah.
Because the 645 is different. You're now increasing your 50,000. And how do we program that in?
That's a really excellent and somewhat aggravating question because I don't have a good answer for you right off the top of my head.
Okay.
Well,
Facts don't
right
take
off the
care of
top
it.
of my head, the 50,000 cost would go up because then that new business would also require to be permitted the inspections, the lab sampling, the lab analysis and everything. So I would assume we would, it would be applied at that same rate and go proportionally.
Yeah, because we don't want to issue,
I know you're looking at a prop.
we don't want to issue Prop 218 notices every time there's a change to the system.
Correct.
And so what we're doing is a study for you that tries to do our best estimate of what projected costs are. To the extent your profile of usage on the system changes, for example, the addition of an industrial customer, I think we would try to handle that without re-noticing everything until your next study 5 years from now.
Yeah, so I think that's what I'm asking is that we maybe go back and look at what do we have coming? What can we anticipate to come, and how do we build that into the system? I don't know if that's possible, but I mean, that would be something that I would hope that we would kind of anticipate for. My next question is, who determines who or how the low, medium, and high is established? Do we have a range? Is there a way in which that's established that's industrial standard, or?
There is, and so State Water Resources Control Board has, over the decades, issued guidance on the strength loading characteristics of different land uses. And also, the Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts has issued a very comprehensive guidance on the strength loading characteristics of different land use types. And in the last study, there were assumptions about what the biochemical oxygen demand and total suspended solid loadings were for low, medium, and high customers. And I have not modified those assumptions after looking at the State Water Control Board estimates of strength loading by customer type. However, there is one big difference from the last study. In the last study, I don't believe we had the third strength loading parameter of total dissolved solids. In this study, because of the $110 million you had to spend, we're recognizing total dissolved solids as a third and new parameter. In fact, in my memory is we're assuming 300 milligrams per liter for TDS.
Loading, yes.
Okay. So kind of along that lines, and changes that have come down the pipe, are there any, no pun intended, are there any expected changes with disposal requirements that we need to take into account over this next 5 years? So are we going to have to start, I just luckily got to do a tour of the wastewater treatment plant, very timely, obviously. And we talked a little bit about disposal and potentially having to truck some of this out further. Is that built into this so that we aren't having to come back and ask the taxpayers for more?
That is not built in, and it is the latest talk of the next thing on the horizon. The specific components that have gained traction in the environmental world are PFAS, PFOA compounds. They show up, the source is man-made, and it comes from anything from, the brand name Scotchgard to, anything, fire retardant foams, things like that. And it's, the nature of it makes it last forever. It's a really long, strong bond compound. So once it's created, it essentially lasts forever. And there are movements out there, that is the latest talk moving forward, of potential requirements to further treat your biosolids, and or an alternative is to haul them to a state with fewer restrictions. But without anything being set or known, and the treatment technologies, I am going to CWA next week. They have a couple presentations on a new technology where they essentially superheat it to your biosolids to a plasma state, and it destroys the compounds. But I don't know what the costs of something like that technology would be on our scale in Beaumont yet. So the answer is that reflected? No. There's always a potential thing on the horizon when it comes to environmental removal.
There is one thing to note, though, in that regard, is I pulled up the financial plan scenario with rate increases and no debt. And so what you're seeing in FY '28 is that we're projecting a level of cash reserves that meets our target. It looks like those ending reserves are in the range of $6 million. Under financial planning scenario 2, which is with debt, we're also in that same $6 million ballpark. So what we try to do with Jennifer is she kind of said, look, we need to make sure that we're ending up at the end of the first half of the planning horizon with a level of debt, with a level of cash reserves that will allow us to meet eventualities in the second half of the planning horizon. And theoretically, PFAS could be one of those things.
Okay, very good. And then just one last question, which may come to you, Thaxton, but what is the time frame? I was not here for the Paracone agreement, so what is the time frame of that terms?
That agreement expires at the end of calendar year 2023.
Thank you.
All right, Councilmember White?
Really good questions, thank you. So last time we did this with the 218 study, the one thing that we got a lot of comments and pushback from the community is going to be more this time because we have more people here who don't consider themselves new people. And the question comes up, and it's sort of along the lines of Mr. Finn brought up, is that if I remember correctly with the 218, you cannot charge future development more than you're charging current development to make up, to keep current rates down, correct?
Yes, sir, I would agree with that. And I just want to make sure I understand, though, before I agree. I guess the notion might be that existing customers might pay a rate, for example, of $4 per 100 cubic feet, whereas new customers might pay a rate of $7 per 100 cubic feet, under the notion that new customers have imposed a higher degree of costs onto your system. I think that, once again, I'm not a regulatory attorney, but that probably doesn't fly under Prop 218 because the issue is what are the proportionate demands they impose on your total system? And I don't know how you would delineate between existing and new. But what new customers should be paying, or at least the developers should be paying, is capacity charges to offset the cost of growth-related capital.
Okay.
And as I think Jennifer may have indicated, we've got projected capacity fee receipts in our financial plan to offset that growth-related capital cost.
Right, but you answered my question. In other words, you can't start charging people who come here in the future, more than you're charging people. I mean, it's a cost of what it costs you to use our system, basically, right?
Yes, sir, I would say so.
Okay. I just want to let you guys know that because you're going to be hit with that. They're going to say, well, why don't you just keep ours flat and charge everyone else who comes in here in the following years more, which is a great idea, but I don't think it's legal. So the residential in your scenario was for fiscal year 24, and you talked about approximately 5.6% increase for residential.
Yes, sir.
How does that, is that level over the 5 years, or is that 5.6% going to stay or go increase?
Yes, sir. So I'm showing the slide right now with that residential rate that was proposed for 24. It says $49.84.
Okay.
And in the proposed rates, this is in the third column over, what would happen is that $49.84 in 2025 would be increased by 9%, which is the overall financial planning increase. And then the next year, it would be increased by the overall financial planning increase. And the next year by the overall financial planning increase. So all of the proposed 2024 rates would climb each year, and this is how you'd show it in the Prop 218 notice, based on the overall financial planning increase. So we've done a detailed cost of service study for 24, and then for the next 4 years, they go up in lockstep with the financial plan.
Okay, so the first year is 5%. The remaining years is based on the financial planning, which
Ye-
right now you're assuming it's around 9%.
Yes, sir, under the all rate increase scenario.
Okay.
No debt, all rates no debt.
Yeah, no, all rates, no debt. That's a better way to say it. Thank you.
Do we have numbers for your mixed preliminary proposed 2024 numbers? I mean, if we did have debt in there, did we have any estimates? If we borrow the 7 million, what 2024 is going to be and what the remaining 4 years will be?
Sir, I have that model, but I apologize, I don't have those numbers in front of me. We can easily get that for you.
Okay. we're subsidizing, the general fund is subsidizing the wastewater fund for administration costs, right? Do either of the plans eliminate that subsidy at all, or are you assuming that that subsidy continues to be there or shrinks, you know, or does it just disappear at the end of the 5 years where we're no longer subsidizing?
The plan has included a percentage amount to less subsidization for year over year.
But not to remove it completely at the end of the
Right,
5 year?
right. And that would be something, if you wanted us to include, we could bring that back.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'd like to see that. I think the others said they would too. And I'm going to ask a question that, well, I'm not running for reelection, so I can ask this question. Actually, it wouldn't really matter, but
Sorry.
if you're annexing new customers off of, what are those things called?
Annexation agreement?
No, instead of we have some customers that are around septic. If you brought in new customers that are currently on septic, and, you know, obviously it would have to be their choice. I'm not suggesting at all that we're going to, you know, take over the world. But would that would that have an impact on our fees going forward?
I think it would, because you're going to have to spend probably a significant amount of money to extend your collection system out to pick up those customers. And that may also, depending on the amount of septic customers, not only be small diameter collection mains, but it may be a little bit larger, what sometimes are called conveyance or interceptor mains. You may also have to install lift stations to deal with elevation changes to get the wastewater back to your treatment plant. So usually when utilities convert septic to piped, for lack of a better term, it's a pretty expensive proposition.
For the current ratepayers as well as the septic tank owners?
Well, that is a great question. And so once again, I'm speaking not as a regulatory attorney. How I've usually seen that done is that in the next cost of service study, those costs will all be blended on a system-wide basis, and we'll develop rates for everyone. I suppose it's possible that what you could impose on the septic customers joining your system in the interim is some sort of surcharge that kind of is a way to offset those costs, but
We generally don't have a ton of septic users, but there are certainly some. You know, I'm thinking, you know, certainly 8th Street right now, and there are others. But in any of those users, if we were able to proceed that way, would be subject to a current capacity fee. So if it's used for either the extension or the upgrading of whatever pipes, you know, that could be capacity fee eligible. And as it currently sits, there's not a mechanism for the city to spearhead those projects, so it would be the responsibility of the actual septic owners. You know, there are certainly, for certain communities, there's at times grant funding available in order to be able to do that. But yes, they would be subject to capacity fees, which would help extend the sewer, and most likely for any of those, we would require that the extension of the sewer be borne by the applicants.
So just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that it's a campaign or a program by the city, but the way our state's going, it's likely at some point our state's going to say, if you're close enough to a sewer system, you're no longer going to be on a septic tank.
Well, we currently have, so code-wise, so if there is existing sewer within, I believe it's 220 feet, sorry, I don't have it in front of me. But if you are within 200 feet of an existing sewer system, then yes, you would be required to connect. Now, we certainly don't have a way to mandate connection if your septic is functioning properly. But if they were to come in for a permit to install a new septic system for one that has failed, then we would then require that they convert over to sewer system.
Okay, and again, historically, 5 years ago when we did this, we got a lot of, some more pushback from the community of, is it called Highland Springs?
Yes.
Okay. And at that time, the discussion came up by the fact that the city could not service outside of the city limits, but we did make the exception there, and those folks paid more. So I lay all that out because since then, we've taken on some obligations to Calamasa and some of their properties. So are those calculated into what we're
Right.
talking about here?
So as far as Calamasa, you know, this currently as it sits, and I believe it's a requirement of our permit with SAPA, is we cannot serve outside of our corporate boundary. It requires an annexation into the corporate boundaries, not just an annexation of service area, but a complete annexation into the city boundary. But for that project specifically is, yeah, we would, and previously we had, when they had an entitled project that is now no longer, is we ran analysis through our model and determined that what their upgrades would be. The extension would have been completely borne by them, as well as any deficiencies downstream all the way back to our treatment plant.
Okay. And one last comment. I brought up the idea before that if we've got to pay somebody interest on $7 million, I'd rather the wastewater treatment be paying the city that interest. Because that may soften the blow, at least for the city as well as, that's all I had. Thank you, Mayor.
Councilmember Lara?
Thank you, Mayor. And since you bring up that 7 million, I'm having trouble with the numbers, so bear with me, please. But when you look at the rate increase with debt, you go to $7 million debt with a 6% increase, right? Without debt, it's 9%. And if I understood your response to my suggestion going 6% over 5 years without debt, as opposed to the 9% increase, you're indicating that we'd probably drop, in 2025, we'd go below, basically be negative on our,
Yes, sir.
right? So, that said then, with 6% and $7 million debt, which is supposed to cover capital improvement projects, correct?
Yes, sir.
That tells me that some of that money would be covering lost revenue, because it's only 6% instead of 9%. Does that make sense?
I hope I give you an intelligent answer, and if I don't, you'll have to allow me to go back and check on it for you. But that 7 million is in effect paying for 2 to 3 or even 4 years of non-growth CIP. And so the debt is offsetting the cash outflows you need to make for CIP, which is why the 6% increase instead of the 9% increase. And when you think about that debt, let's say you get 7 million coming in 2024.
Right.
The way it's shown.
Right.
Let's say that 7 million in 2024 is offsetting or paying for funding $2.5 million of CIP.
Okay.
Well, in 2024, the difference between the 7 and the 2.5 million will increase your cash reserves in 2024. And then in the next year, whatever amount of debt is left over, it's going to fund some CIP. And if there's any little bit of debt left over, that's going to increase your cash reserves. And so in this scenario 2, which has got the debt, I think the reason the cash reserves work out meeting your minimum target with just 6% increases is you're not spending all of that 7 million just like that.
Right.
You're kind of spending it out over time.
Okay.
And what you haven't spent, those unused proceeds, are in effect sitting in cash.
Okay. Thank you. Whenever a new developer is got a proposal for development, they have to provide us with a study, correct?
Yeah, and actually, depending on what it is, so yes, they would do a study, but since we adopted the master plan, we typically would do the analysis in-house. Yeah, with funds from the developer, they put up a deposit. We would use our consultant that did the master plan to analyze their impacts via the hydraulic model that they developed.
So, and I know a lot of the developments now need lift stations in order to get to the wastewater treatment plant. Does our analysis include some type of what I'll call a lift station surcharge? Because a lot of the older developments are gravity flows, so you don't have that additional maintenance on the system as you do with a lift station. So do we include like a surcharge to help offset the maintenance over time for a lift station?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Could we look at doing something like that? Because that's one of the things we're looking at what, 2 million per Mesa lift station? 1.5 million? So, those lift stations are expensive to maintain. Couldn't we do some type of a surcharge that the developer picks up when they want to access or buy into our wastewater treatment system or sewer system?
And sir, would that be for maintenance?
Yes, sir.
I don't think you can. I think if we looked at California's statutes regarding capacity fees recover growth-related capital. And I think I guess you could do a surcharge for the O&M. It would be separate outside of the capacity fees, and you'd have to figure out a way to do it on a proportional basis, meaning the costs incurred to do maintenance on a lift station associated with subdivision X versus the costs incurred to do maintenance on a lift station on subdivision Y. So I don't think it can be recovered through capacity fees. That's not what you're suggesting. I think it's possible that you could recover it through some O&M surcharge on rates, but I think it'd be complex to figure out how to do it proportionally and stay in compliance with Prop 218.
Okay. And then one last question. On the multifamily, we show that rate is actually going to is projected based on our current study to possibly go down, which I understand. You've got more families, fewer tie-ins in multifamily residential development. Why wouldn't that same nexus go for schools? Because they're like multifamily, where you've got a large number of students so how was that study done? Was that done by volume or?
Yes, sir. It was really trying to estimate the volume of discharges provided by schools in 2024. So that's a projection. And then those schools do have BOD, TSS, and total dissolved solid strength loadings associated with them. And those assumptions regarding volume and strength loadings resulted in a revenue requirement. And then we divided those by the projected number of students. And so it wasn't so much a density analysis as it was just what's the proportionate cost of service and what are the projected number of students and what's the fallout dollar per student. So it may be just a little bit different than the multifamily analysis. And I think one of the things that I'm hoping to do with Thaxton here over the next few days is really look at all of these assumptions, including the assumptions associated with schools and what those discharge volumes are.
Okay. And I apologize, just one last thing. Do we know or have we looked at the potential impact? I know the state is really pushing these ADUs and taking a lot of our zoning rights away. And so ADUs are going to increase capacity on our system. Is that going to do anything to affect the residential rate? Or is there anything that we could look at when you have somebody adding multiple ADUs on a single-family residential lot?
And sir, you're maybe referring to what's known as accessory dwelling units?
I apologize, thank you.
Well,
Yes, sir.
No, sir, there was no analysis done in this study associated with that.
And I believe the state is prohibiting us from doing so.
Right, and then, I don't know, I'm sure Ms. Taylor can speak to this more, but that's something that's been a concern, traffic as well, is the ability to instill a connection fee for accessory dwelling units.
it doesn't seem to calculate, right? Because you've got a reduction on multifamily, and in essence, the state's going to require us to create multifamily on single. Okay, thank you. That's all I have. Thanks, Mayor.
Last questions for me. So the target levels that are in there those are to keep the self-sustaining funding? Is that the purpose of the target, or is that something that we came up with as counselors, for our projection?
It's within the council's policies, the 25% for reserve, correct?
Okay. And then the study was different now because of what you mentioned earlier about the different ways we looked at the BOD, call it TDS and so forth, correct?
Yes,
That's
sir.
why this study looked different from the 5-year prior study.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then just to make sure I'm adding these up, right? If I look at the rate increase with no debt, you're looking at a 30% increase overall, I guess you can say. Whereas with debt, you're looking at a 28%. So there's only a 2% difference, but one has the 7 million on the,
And one's front-loaded, the no debt,
okay.
and one's smooth and, shall we say, predictable, the one with debt.
With the debt, okay. And that front loads the 9% up front on those 2 years. Okay.
And I just want to emphasize, I'm really glad Jeff came up. You know, Councilman member, when you asked the question about septic, I gave you some goofy answer. Jeff rescued me and noted that you'd be paying a capacity fee. So just want to emphasize that.
Councilmember Lara, another one?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No? Okay. All right, so, do you want to see if there's any callers in just before we wrap up to see?
Grace, do we have any callers on the line?
We have no callers on the line.
Okay. All right. Okay, and seeing none in the audience then, okay.
Sorry, maybe just real quick. Okay, Terry would like to speak.
He does want to speak, okay. And that's what I thought, perhaps.
Yeah.
So let me open up the public comment at 5:46.
You have to be on the mic.
Yeah, and come up to the mic and give us your 3-minute spiel.
Sorry, I didn't put in the comment card. So I've been listening, and I represent Pericone Juices. I've been with them through the last 10 years. So obviously, anytime you see this, I'm sitting back there with my calculator, trying to figure out how in the heck we're gonna manage these rising costs, right? And we kind of knew some were coming. We've been working closely, partnering with the city, and I think great group to work with. But a question I have for you guys tonight is, what's the timing are we looking at from this study, from leaving a workshop and being a final?
The goal is for next fiscal year, because that's when this
Next fiscal
rate
year?
study. Yeah,
July 1.
When this,
July 1, 2023?
3.
So pretty quick. Okay. Okay. No, that's all I really had. Thank you very much. I learned a lot.
Right, thank you. All right, so we'll close on comment 5:47 PM. No, did you have something? I heard it.
Yeah, you
So I
did. You
figured.
heard that because I was thinking out loud clearly. I did have a question actually regarding. Let me go to the slide for us really quick. It would be on slide 29. In speaking about the industrial customers, my assumption is that these proposed bill impacts are annually, whereas the other ones were noted to be monthly.
You know,
For this
that's an-
500 and.
yeah. That's an astute observation. They are annual.
Okay, so thank you. So this change would be annually for them.
So I think that, and Jennifer, jump in and correct me, and also city manager. In order to have rates become effective on July 1st, we need to issue a Prop 218 notice no later than approximately May 5th to May 10th. And so that is going to will define, city manager Jennifer, how you want to proceed in the month of April. We're on the 10th now. We need direction from council regarding financial planning scenarios, and we can produce rates under both scenarios, debt and no debt. Feston and I will do some additional work on the analytics. Would we come back to council at another public presentation to show the results of that? Okay.
That'll be at a council meeting now. We're done with the workshop, so.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We would not hold another workshop for this.
All right. Oh, didn't see it.
One comment and a question. The question is for the newer council members. The comment is, I don't think I'm going to be here for the April meeting. That's nice. And for David and Jessica, when you were not on council 5 years ago, and you learned that we were going to raise your rates 5% a year for the next 5 years, what were your first thoughts?
I'll go first. I was a member of the public and here for those meetings, so I witnessed a good number of those. And I saw the public uproar and felt for you guys and the tough decision that you had to make. That's why I asked about the capacity fee to say, okay, what can be put on any new project, homeowner, or whatever that is impacting the system and causing us to spend more money for capital improvements. But if a lot of it is needed to fix an aging system, and recognizing that best efforts were put to this point, it may be if I can even get the word out, thank you. It might be just something we might be forced to do and have to do, and we just have to make that tough decision and face the public on it. So I'm ready for it.
Okay.
I will say that obviously I don't want anything to be raised. I think that's difficult, but much like Councilmember Fenn saying, I think our feet may be held to the fire a little bit on some of this. I do like the proposal of the general fund. That was going to be my suggestion as well, or ask if that was possible. And I can say that coming from a management experience and somebody who has lower paid staff, this weighs heavy. I know that a 7% inflation on everything is something that's difficult. And so I think that this also kind of plays in, unfortunately, to all of that, and something that I have staff members in my office daily about it. So, yeah, it's
My wife hasn't let me forget it. And continued to say those rates you raised.
yeah.
Great.
So
Yeah.
I know that
Yeah.
I'm not looking forward to letting her know again.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
Anyways,
But I do remember, though, that when the bill comes out, I thought it gave us what it was gonna go up to, and it showed the number, like from 47 to 49, and the next year would go up to 52 or whatever. Well, that's now, but back then it was different. And I had people come up because they heard the percent, it was going up, and then when they looked, it's going at $2. Then they weren't so much upset because they saw that it wasn't as big as they thought it was. And instead of promoting that it was going up, percentage, they looked at the number and they said, well, if we need it, I think it's a little easier to swallow, maybe. So, just a comment.
so this will come back to council in the next council meeting? Late April?
No, it will come back to council hopefully May 2nd.
I'll still be out.
Let me look at that.
So, well, you can Zoom. Yeah. That's one of those things you can do. Yeah, uh-huh. So direction, there were a couple comments from here, you got all that, but there were some where we were asking you to come back with numbers. Mr. White asked about that, and I think there was a couple over here on how it would look, and you got all those notes down?
Yeah, and I'd also like to offer, we will bring back a plan for that 7 million.
Okay, and then I'd like a little bit more info on that 15 million down there under the other CIP.
You want the detail on the CIP?
Well, I mean, something a little bit more confident, so I just know it's just not a pot of money sitting there, a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't expect you to break down every part of that.
We can
A
give you a
little bit more
spreadsheet.
general would
Yeah.
be nice for me.
This has been difficult But this goes back to what Thexton said, the amount of capital projects that have been kicked down the road. It's really all coming to a head right now. Couple that with the $100 million treatment plant and the debt service payment on that.
One last thing, when you do bring it back, we always love to see a comparison of what our neighbors are paying.
Yes, yeah. I had that question, yes.
So with that bringing back, do we know now if it's with debt or without, or is it gonna be both options and we'll vote on it at that time?
We'll bring back both.
Okay, both options and see,
And the plan right now is May. We want to make that deadline.
of course.
But if we don't make that deadline, then current rates extend. So we'd like the July 1st.
So if we don't make July 1st, 2023, then the next deadline is July 21st, 2024?
No. It goes into effect once the whole Prop 218 hearing happens.
So it'll be past the fiscal year, but
That's
it'll-
what I'm saying.
but yeah, okay.
Because
It'll-
we're going to be,
within the fiscal year, I guess. you should say.
right, correct.
Okay, well, I think we're pretty much, we got a good vision. I think there was just some fine tuning we wanted to know about the 7 and the numbers and stuff, but I think we're pretty good. And to have a treatment system, as much as we've already invested, to not continue with its, operating at optimum level is kind of silly. It doesn't make sense, so, yeah, I think so. Any other comments from council? Any last minute comments, Mr. Wright? Okay.
Thank you.
Very well, we thank you for your time. Thank you for taking all the grilling from us. You did well, very professional. Appreciate it. Oh, in that case. Okay, anything else from staff before we conclude? Looking good? Yes, because there's another one starting in 5 minutes. So with that, we'll close our workshop at 5:56 PM.